All right, everybody. I am so excited to have Colin Carr on the show today from Carr Healthcare. And one of the things, Colin, that I really love to do when I start off my podcast is just to find out everybody's why. And especially you as an entrepreneur, I'm super excited to hear about your why. How did you get into healthcare? What brought about Carr Healthcare? And specifically what you're doing within our industry?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So first of all, Jill, it's great to see you again. We were
Right.
talking before we jumped on. But you and I go back to the beginning of 2009. So
Crazy.
past 14, 15 years.
Yeah.
My why is pretty simple. I've been in real estate since I was 19 years old. I started in property management, moved into brokerage when I was in my early 20s, and I was a generalist to start. So I was a Walmart, Wendy's, Blockbuster, coffee shop, anything that was retail I did for a while. Later transitioned to doing more office space and enjoyed that. And then I had the opportunity to work on a couple of healthcare deals about 15, 16 years ago. And I was working on the landlord side for a very large national publicly traded landlord. It was a medical office building. And I had two transactions specifically where I was working for the landlord. The doctor was unrepresented and the doctor got just completely manhandled in the deal. Like I remember sitting down talking to the doctor, asking them questions like, do you know the market? Do you have a broker? Are you looking at moving? And they gave all the wrong answers. And I had a fiduciary to go back and give my landlord client that information. So I did. And the landlord just completely crushed those doctors. I had a plastic surgeon and then I had a dentist. And just the light bulb for me went on and it was, hey, listen, these are good people. These are people that actually care about making a difference in the lives of their patients and the lives of their staff and their communities. And they just don't know the rules of engagement. Like they don't realize that you say the wrong thing or you do the wrong thing and it can cost you literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's what happened is these doctors ended up signing leases to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars more expensive than they should have paid if they knew what they're doing. So I had
Yes.
a couple of those scenarios where just the light bulb went on and I just started going after healthcare providers as the tenant or buyer side. And within a number of months of doing that, I had a handful of healthcare clients and they were so grateful and appreciative for what we were able to do for them. That not only
Mhm.
just the economic savings, but the time savings. And then you could just tell it was this huge weight off their shoulders and this peace of mind. And so it didn't take me very long once I started focusing on that to realize like this is a great niche. And I got really excited about it. And for me personally, the summary to your question, my why, I just liked the way it felt. I felt like I
Mhm.
was making more of an impact and influence in these doctors' lives than I was like in large like office companies or large retailers. And I felt like I had a genuine relationship with the client and their a lot of times their spouse or their office manager and their staff. And for me, it just felt the most rewarding. And so back in the beginning of '09, I launched our company now, Carr or Carr
Yep.
Healthcare Realty. And that's what we've been doing for the last 14, 15 years.
What a great story. And it's fun to know that I knew you in the beginning as well. I am on that other side working with those doctors. And to know that we've got somebody that's making sure that they're keeping our best interest at heart and it isn't just this quick transition. So I have a lot of newer docs on this podcast. That's why I started is I really wanted to get good information out to younger doctors who may be younger in the career of maybe getting into starting their practice or whatnot. And one of the things I've always loved about you guys is what you bring to the table and helping not only educate, but just really looking out, like I said, for our doc's best interest. And what I would love it if you could do is we're going to probably get really basic for some people out there, but I'd love it if we could talk a little about what your teams are looking for and things that doctors should be looking for in when they're thinking about entering into a lease. Because I think this is one of the biggest contractual agreements beside the loan that they're gonna take out for their practice.
Yes.
And I think there's actually more ramifications in what goes on to a lease than probably what we have with our bank loans.
Yeah, I would agree. The bank loans typically are going to be a smaller amount of money than the lease. And then the bank loans can typically be refinanced as well. usually right away with some type of a penalty, but usually after 2 or 3 years with no penalties. Yeah, once you lock into that lease contract, it's typically a 10-year contract, and you are not going to get out of that without a massive penalty. So, yeah, we're looking at two, I'd say, big elements here. We're looking at the actual property or properties and trying to figure out what are the top options, what are the best fits, and we can talk about that in a second. And then we're looking at what are the economics for that actual contract, whether it's a lease or purchase. So if we start with the first one, which is the actual properties, our game plan is to uncover every viable option that meets enough of the requirements or criteria for the client that they can consider these are the top options for you. And in some markets, that might be 3 or 4 properties. Other markets, you might have 10 or 12. It depends on inventory. It's a big difference between markets. And then what we're going to do from there is we're going to start whittling that list down based upon the landlord's ability to contribute financially to the deal, if the economics make sense. And so we're looking at concepts. Do they want to be in retail or office? Do they want to, what's the square footage? Who are the neighboring tenants? What's the parking? What's the access, the visibility, the signage, all of the aesthetics that go in there? Then we're trying to figure out how can we get down to a short list of the top properties. And then our game plan is we don't decide for the client. We present the top options. And what we're doing is we're educating the client. We're educating them to say, okay, you're going to get more windows in an office building than you are in a retail, but you're going to get better signage and visibility typically in a retail versus office. Or
Yes.
this property might cost more, but here are the upsides. And so what we're doing is we're bringing them information, we're educating them in the process, and then ultimately they're the person who's going to make the final decision. So
Mhm.
we don't make the decision for them, but we arm them with information, with details, with all these things that maybe are not readily available or easily understood. And so that's one side. Once we pick the top 3 or 4 properties, our game plan is we want to negotiate simultaneously with multiple landlords or sellers. And that's a big difference in commercial real estate versus residential real estate. So residential real estate, you look at houses either in person or online. When you find that house that you really want, you submit a contract, you sign it. And if the seller signs, that's a binding agreement. Now, typically you have ability to cancel for inspection or for loan, but you're under a binding agreement at that point. Commercial real estate, it's non-binding until you sign that final purchase contract or that final lease agreement. And what that looks like is we're going maybe 2, 3, 4 rounds of negotiations with 3 or 4 landlords. And the reason that's important is because there's just so many different elements to the deal. Like in residential, it's what's the purchase price, and then how fast can you close? And then there's an element of financial strength. How much financing do you need, or how strong are you financially? Do we have to have concerns about your loan? Commercial real estate, we're looking at usually it's a different square footage or different size in every building.
Mhm.
It's a different landlord, it's different spaces. And then we get into concepts like how much free rent do we need for build out? How much free rent once they open? What's the lease rate going to be? How much money can we get the landlord to contribute to the deal in the form of a tenant
Yes.
improvement allowance? What are the annual increases? What type of personal guarantees for the doctor are we working with? Do we need an option to expand, an option to renew, maybe an option to purchase? So there's all these other things that are there. And then you have the reality that each of these landlords has a different financial position. Some are strong with a cash position and they're willing to give a lot more cash. Other ones are really tight in their leverage. And so they can't give as much like cash concessions. And so the whole idea is we want to go back and forth the place where we can get the best and final terms with multiple landlords or sellers. And then same thing, we're presenting this information to the client, and then they're going to make a decision, and they're not going to have to wonder, was there a better property that I should have looked at? Did we negotiate as competitively as possible? Like, they're going to know unequivocally, yes, we didn't leave anything on the table. Here's best and final terms. Here's 3 or 4 properties. And then ultimately what that brings is peace of mind. You don't have to
Yeah.
wake up every day for the next 10 years saying, I should have hired representation, or I should have looked at more properties, or I should have negotiated harder. All of those elements are off the table. And so you move forward with the property knowing I got the best property that fit my needs, that fit my budget, got the best terms possible for the current economic environment. And then you basically can put that in the back of your mind and move forward with your practice. And so it's economics, it's location, it's time savings, it's all this. But honestly, I think that honestly, the peace of mind is as valuable as any of those other previous benefits.
Yeah, that's such good information, and I think that docs just really need to know that no matter who they're working with, you guys especially, we want brokers that are bringing that information and giving you the information to help you make the best decision possible. Because, like you said, in case somebody missed that, most of the time we're signing a minimum of a 10-year lease, so it's not like you can just be like, I didn't really mean to do this. I'm gonna get out of it. You're stuck there for 10 years. One thing I'd like you to elaborate on just a little bit, and again, I'm going to go super basic here, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the areas that I'm really telling my docs to pay attention to is the square footage of this space. And I'm usually seeing anywhere minimum 1,500 square feet, maximum about 2,500 for just a basic startup orthodontic practice. Now, you and I both know can go way more than that, way less than that, but I always feel like that's a good starting point. But one of the things that I feel like my doctors don't really understand is that there is more that goes into rent than just rent. So when they look at that square footage and they're like, oh, it's only $33 a square foot. A lot of times, what they don't realize is there's some hidden things that are also on their cam, maybe taxes. I'm seeing all kinds of, even this last year, some newer things that landlords are putting in. Would you mind just opening that up for us and talking about that, about the things like kind of those baseline things that we need to really be paying attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a number of things and you mentioned them. You've got the base lease rate, or it could be a full service lease rate. So you want to know, is it a triple net lease, a full service, a modified gross? And just for the sake of simplicity, each one of those lease structures means that there's different amounts of costs in addition to the number they quote you. So you got your base lease rate typically, which is the advertised rate, and that's what everyone focuses on. And that's like the equivalent of someone's mortgage. That's the payment that you're going to make to the landlord. But just like in residential, you've also got other costs. You've got property taxes. So you've got to pay your proportionate share of property taxes for the commercial property. There is insurance on that property as well. There are operating expenses, any cost it takes to run that property. So you've got landscaping, you've got exterior lighting, you've got snow removal, depending on the location of the property. You've got property management fees. You might have janitorial fees for cleaning the outside of the property, or if it's an office building, you have janitorial fees for cleaning the common areas, the restrooms, stuff like that. So depending on the property, there could be a line item list of literally 25 or 30 costs that get pushed through. And that's typically encompassed in what's called operating expenses. Sometimes people will call it CAM, although that's not technically the correct. CAM is only a portion of it, but they call it CAM, common area maintenance. And then you've got triple nets, or variable operating expenses. So long story short, you got the base lease rate, you've got insurance, you have taxes, and then you have all the other operating expenses that go in there. And then on top of that, you have to decipher between, does the landlord provide janitorial services and do they pay your utilities, or do you pay those in addition to as well?
Yes.
And then I'll
Yes.
give you one more element too. The landlord carries insurance on the actual real estate, the property. You carry insurance though, in addition to the landlord, on your interior build out and your interior personal property, equipment, technology, stuff like that. So if you're working with a good real estate agent, they're going to help paint the picture of all the costs. And like you said, a lot of people would just lock onto a lease rate. What's similar to residential, they just lock onto a mortgage calculator, and then they forget that there might be $25,000 a year in taxes on that property. And there might be $1,000 per month, like homeowners association fee. And there might be all these other costs that are there. And so it's to your point, you got to have the entire collective amount of money you're going to be paying so that you can say, this is the true cost for me per month.
Now let's talk a little bit about TI allowance. Again, we're throwing out names here that people may or may not know, but I think this is a big thing that we have to also really pay attention to. And for those of you that don't know, TI is tenant improvement allowance, and I'll let you, Colin, explain a little bit more about that. But I think a lot of times we can really focus in on how much TI we're getting, but we also have to keep in mind that can be a negotiating tool for us on rent. So, can you break it down for us about what TI is? Because I think a lot of people don't quite have a good understanding of that, and how that can help or hurt us when we're going through negotiations, and how we may be playing with that number a little bit.
Yeah. So like you said, so TI allowance refers to tenant improvement allowance. Sometimes it's called a build out allowance. It's called a renovation allowance or landlord's concessions. Those are all synonymous concepts. But what we're dealing with is the idea that landlords are willing to invest in the deal or the space in exchange for a long-term lease. So if you went to a landlord and said, hey, I want to do a 6-month term, number one, they probably wouldn't even consider that. But number two, they're not going to give you any concession for doing that. However, most commercial leases in retail and office buildings, especially for healthcare providers, are long-term leases. They're typically a 10-year lease. And in exchange for you being willing to sign up for that long-term lease, the landlords will contribute cash into the deal in the form of a TI allowance. Um, so there's a couple of things with TI allowance. Typically, we're working with it on a per square foot basis. Sometimes it's a lump sum. They'll say, hey, I'll give you $100,000. Then we can break that down to a per square foot number. But typically, we're looking at it. What is the per square foot cost of that contribution? And then there's a lot of ways to look at the TI allowance. There's some landlords that even if you get no TI allowance, they will not go below a certain lease rate. So let me just use some round numbers. Like no matter whether they give you $0 for TI allowance or 100,000, they're not going to go below, let's say, $25 a square foot. And you say, why not? The answer is because the value of the property is predicated upon the lease rate. And so if they go lower on that lease rate, they've just devalued their property. And so a lot of landlords won't go below a certain lease rate, whether they give you money or not. And so there's typically an amount of money in a deal that a landlord will give the tenant that doesn't change the lease rate. Like, hey, the lease rate's not going below $25 a foot no matter what. And then with that $25 a square foot, whether you get zero or you got maybe even $50 per square foot, that lease rate's not going to change. And so there's an amount of money you can capture in almost every deal that basically is money the landlord's already determined this, they're going to set aside, invest in the space, invest in the deal,
Yes.
and that's available to you. A lot of people will go to landlords when they're unrepresented and saying, hey, give me the best deal possible without TI allowance. That's a bad game plan because you don't know how much money you just left on the table.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then on the other side of the coin, there is a level where once the landlord goes with a higher TI allowance, they're going to start pushing that money back into the lease rate and they're going to bump the lease rate proportionate. So they're going to, let's say you said, hey, I need $150,000 in TI versus 100. They'd say, great, we'll give you the extra 50, but we're going to amortize it into the lease rate with an interest rate because there's a cost of money for us to give you our money. And so maybe now that lease rate is going to be $27 a foot start versus 25. And again, you start breaking down the numbers.
Mhm.
When it comes to the TI allowance, most startups are going to need some contribution from the landlord that's significant. Otherwise, they typically run out of money. They can only get so much money from the bank. And by the time you get into the cost of the build out, you get into the cost of equipment and technology, all the other working capital needs, consultant, marketing, sundries, working capital for a few months. Like you don't have enough money if the landlord doesn't give you some money. And so don't be afraid to get money from a landlord. That's one of the benefits of leasing space versus purchasing. You put all the money in yourself and there's benefits of purchasing. But when you're leasing, you're looking for a free build out period. You're looking for free rent upon opening. You're looking for a very healthy contribution from that landlord. And that helps you to limit how much you borrow, how much you pay in interest back to the bank. It helps your cash flow. And so it typically helps you get a deal done because usually without it, you're going to have a hard time unless you have a parent or you've got a lot of cash yourself. Even if you have a lot of cash, my personal opinion is keep your cash.
Agreed.
Yep. I mean,
Agreed.
even right now, money is more expensive right now than it was a few years ago, but money is still relatively cheap in the history of financing and borrowing money. The last 50 years, money's still pretty cheap, believe it
Yep.
or not. So
It's other people's money.
yes, yes. Because if things ever do get tighter, or if you have other aspirations, if you have that cash, you're going to be in a position of strength. When you have very little cash and you're leveraged, you're in a weaker position. So anyways, we talk a lot about TI allowance, but I guess my top point is that don't be afraid to get the money from the landlord. Yes, you could have some that gets pushed back into the lease rate and bumps the lease rate, but we could typically find that sweet spot of what's the most we can get before the lease rate increases. And then you can make an educated decision of, yes, hey, I need more money. Let's go ahead and bump that lease rate because I'm going to run out of loan money. Or no, I don't need that much. I've got enough of my loan. And so let's go with the lower lease rate, the lower TI allowance. And again, it's like a scale. You're trying to balance it. And there usually is a pretty good balancing level.
And what one of the things, again, I'm just going to say it, that I really appreciate about your brokers is they are so good at helping my clients with this and understand this. And you're exactly right. There may be times where we're looking for that sweet spot and we understand that, okay, this TI isn't going to pay out till a month or two after we open, but it gives us the comfort to say, okay, we can spend our allocated working capital up through when we open, knowing that tenant improvement is going to come right back in again, fill up our bank account, and now we've got our working capital again. So there's a lot of strategic movements that we're making here. And I think when we're working with brokers that really understand this and can help a doctor, and I'm just going to echo what you said, the scariest thing I see is when docs choose to try and do this by themselves because there's just so much money that you could be leaving on the table, but also you could be really getting yourself into a position where you're in a long-term commitment that may not be great. So when you are reviewing leases and when you guys are helping get to the point, I know that we do an LOI and then we get to a lease. Can you talk about that process and maybe things that you think doctors should be aware of? And maybe at first talk about the LOI component. What are we doing there? And then what happens when we get to the before we've signed the lease?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the LOI stands for letter of intent. Sometimes it also, again, commercial real estate is famous for coming up with 17 ways to say the same thing. You can also be called a request for proposal, depending on how it's presented. But you get to a letter of intent, and the idea is that the letter of intent is going to be a summary of the main economic and the main business deal points that have been negotiated. So when does the lease start? What's the build out period? What's the free rent, the TI allowance, the annual increases, who's guaranteeing the lease? All the major business deal points are outlined in the letter of intent. Once you get to where you have a professional agreement between the two parties, the landlord and then the tenant, it said, hey, listen, this works for both of us, let's move forward. Then the landlord will have their attorney draft a lease agreement. And that's when you go from having a 1 or 2 or 3 page letter of intent. And then that thing grows into a 40, 50, 60, 70 page lease contract. And that is where the tenant needs to get a very good real estate attorney involved. So a good real estate agent will still open that lease up. They can't legally practice law and give legal advice. Again, that is against the law. That's them acting as an attorney. But what they can do is they can go through that lease and they can at least double check that the major deal points that were negotiated in the LOI did make it into the lease. And
Yeah.
so if the lease rate was agreed upon at $25 a square foot, they can still look at the rent table and see if it says it's starting at 25 a square foot. If it was a 10-year lease with 4 months of free rent, they can verify that it says those things. Now, if there's an issue with that, they're still going to go to the real estate attorney and say, hey, I noticed this, but again, I'm not practicing law, but I'm just telling you what I noticed. And then what happens at that point is the tenant's attorney will review the lease, provide comments on what's called red line or track changes to where they make any changes that are there. And then that'll go back to the landlord's attorney. And then the two parties will work together to get a fair lease. Now, let me give a couple very key points here. The lease is going to be in favor of the landlord every single time.
Just say that one more time. Just say
Yes,
that one more time.
it's the lease is always in the favor of the landlord because they are the person offering the benefit here. So this is no different. If you looked at a credit card contract, it's going to be in favor of the creditor, not in the favor of the person getting the credit card.
Yes.
With a student loan, it's going to be in favor of the lending institution or the university, not the person borrowing. Like when you get a mortgage on a house, it's the same thing. So if someone is extending credit to you or they're extending a monetary value, they are the one, number one, with the most risk. They are the one that has the highest burden to prove something that, like, if there's ever a dispute, judges typically favor on behalf of the inferior party, the tenant. So the landlord has a higher requirement. They have a higher investment. They have more liability, and they're the one that's giving you something that you don't have. So the game plan is not to get a lease that's going to make you feel like you really won like the legal negotiation. The game plan is to get it to where it's fair. And a good commercial real estate attorney will do that. With this too, I'll give them a couple of side points here. You want a real estate attorney. You don't want an attorney
Yes.
that practices family law and does marriage disputes. You don't want a tax attorney. You don't want a litigation attorney. You don't want
A family friend that a while ago.
so many forms of law. You want a real estate contract attorney. And here's why: they know what should or shouldn't be in a lease. They will not waste your time by telling you to change language that's not going to get changed. They will be efficient. They will respect your time. It'll cost you less and they'll give you the highest level of protection.
Yes.
Conversely, you get an attorney that doesn't do real estate and they'll start marking that lease up. They'll start telling you you shouldn't accept these terms, even though any tenant in the entire world's going to have those same terms. And so they'll start saying things like, this isn't fair. This doesn't seem right. It is fair and it is right. That's how real estate works. So good real estate attorney is paramount. It'll save you time, save you money. And then also you don't want to make a landlord upset by asking for things that aren't reasonable.
Mhm.
Okay. And this is no different than if a patient came in there and started trying to carve up your insurance contract, like with an insurance provider, you'd be like, this is standard. This is how it works. There's a level of reasonableness of asking for changes. And there's a level where you press beyond the measure and the landlord feels like you're a novice or you don't know what you're doing. So a good real estate attorney can make your life simple, save you time, save you money. A bad attorney can make you look like an idiot or a fool, honestly, because you're asking for stuff that you should not be asking for. They can delay the process and they will run up a bill that you shouldn't be running those bills up. So for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that so many people just take that for granted, just like not getting a commercial broker involved that actually deals with healthcare. Same thing with the lawyer. If we've got the wrong people on our team, it can cost you a lot of time, could cost you a deal, and could cost you a lot of money, especially if you've got the wrong person that's billing you by the hour or by the minute.
There's a really famous saying where people say, you never know if you don't ask. And that is not always true. You can ask somebody for something that's not reasonable, or you can press beyond the measure and you can frustrate people. For instance, like if you charged $5,000 for Invisalign and someone walked up and you said, would you do it for $200? Like that's not going to make you
Mm.
excited to work with that patient. You're going to say, you're not asking me for a discount or for me to help you or a monthly plan or something that's reasonable. You're disrespecting me and you're asking me to lose thousands of dollars. And so people say, you don't know if you don't ask. You say, well, you do know if you don't ask. There's certain levels. And so
Right.
it's the same thing with real estate. You want to get the best terms possible. But if you go in there so aggressive, you're going to make people not want to work with you. If you ask people to do things that aren't reasonable, they're not going to respect you. And it's the same thing. The doctors can have the same thing for staff. If a staff should be paid here and then staff ask them for 4 times the salary, that doctor's not going to want to hire that staff. They're going to say, this person's not reasonable. And so there's the same element there with everyone you work with: contractors, architects. You want the best terms possible. You want the fairest process. But having really qualified people, they'll tell you what the boundaries are. They'll say, hey, we can push harder, but here's how we have to present it. Or, hey, I think we've hit our limit where we're going to get a negative response if we go much more aggressive. So let's just be thoughtful of how we ask for this next round of negotiations. And that's a really good piece of advice, I think, and not just for real estate, but for the attorneys and for everyone else involved.
So taking into consideration where the market is at right now, and I think it is, in my opinion, watching my docs trying to find spaces in general, especially depending upon certain states, are much harder than another. If you were, let's just say, talking to your sister and she's, hey, Colin, I'm going to be negotiating a lease. What are some things that you would really make sure that you're insisting on for her or for a doc out there, especially just taking into consideration where our market is right now? Because I think we're in this different we've got some different things happening right now
Yeah.
than we had. I'm just going to say pre-COVID, because I
Yeah.
feel like that's like our pivot point on everything at the
Yeah, no, it is definitely a different market. Let me start with what is similar today versus pre-COVID. In a lot of markets, the inventory and the amount of competition for spaces is actually pretty similar. There are a lot of office users that have downsized, that have moved out of spaces. So if you're looking for office space, there might be a few more options for you. We have seen a number of retailers that have had a challenging time, but we've seen a surge in new retailers, new franchises come to the market too. So there's not much of a difference today as far as like the competition in most markets. It's a competitive market. It is still what we'd call a landlord's market. But what has happened over the last, few years is that landlords have become even more aware than ever before of how favorable healthcare providers are for tenants. And so I'm saying the same thing. Landlords today, if presented properly, I think will push a little bit harder to land a healthcare user than they would have pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, there was so much activity, so much interest in every space, and there was a lot of uncredit-worthy tenants running around. A lot of those people have gotten washed to the side, but there's also been a surge of new retailers and all those things we just talked about. So I would say this, the market is similar pre-COVID, the market's different pre-COVID, but regardless of whether the market's up or down or whether someone hears this maybe even in 6 months and the market's even different, the most important elements are hire professional representation, understand all your options, look at options to lease, look at options to purchase, get multiple options for financing so you really understand who the best fit for you is. And then make sure that you have a good agent that's helping you to go back and forth with 3 or 4 different landlords because whether you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you've got 10 options, or whether you're downtown Manhattan and you have two, again, the key is to make sure that you don't miss seeing viable properties and you don't leave money on the table. And so, what I would tell someone, family member, or what I would do for myself is just that: is I would find all my options. I would pick the top 4 or 5. I would negotiate 3 or 4 rounds simultaneously, and I would see how competitive I could get each landlord to come to the table with terms. And then when I decide on the property, I'm not going to wonder if I left money at the table. And then one more element I would say with this too is don't try to time the market. People say, well, I'm going to wait 3 months to see if it softens. You can't time the stock market. You can't time the market. Everyone has been predicting that like the S&P would just tank in it. It's gone up a couple hundred points in the last, eh, nobody knows the future as far as where rents are going to be or what's going to happen. And even if something does happen in the world, let's say there's a huge crisis, stock market crash, world war, political issue, whatever, the commercial real estate market still lags the residential market quite a bit. And so whether rates are at 6 or 7% or they're at 3, the market's going to keep moving. So do the best you can with what you have right now. And then if rates go down, refinance your loan. In the future, if rates go down, renegotiate your lease and renew it and get better terms, or maybe you go purchase. But it's more important to find a great property with the best terms possible, get in the game, open your own
Yes,
practice,
yeah.
or capitalize on the current market than it is trying to save $500 a month with the lower lease rate and wait for the next 12 months, hoping that you waited a year to open your own practice. You lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to save
Yes.
$6,000. It just doesn't make sense. So don't try to have the magic 8 ball or the crystal ball. Just move forward with the best options you have right now.
That's such good insight, and I completely agree with you on that, is that we should be it's scary, it's hard, and I think it's pick your hard, right? Whether you do it now or a year from now, there's gonna be different challenges. Who knows what a year from now will hold? And we can look back and go, "It was really hard when I had startups starting in COVID." But you know what? Every single one of them made it, and every single one of them are doing great, and they're 2 years into their business now, so going into 3. So I think that's such good information. You did say something that kinda piqued my interest a little bit, and I would like to talk about this for just a second. I also know that you guys also work with existing practices, and I think we don't just have startup doctors here, but you had said talking about renegotiating your lease. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we could have a doc that is about 10 years and I'm getting ready to have to negotiate my lease, and I didn't even know that there's somebody out there that can actually help me do that. Do you mind expanding on that just a little bit for us?
Yeah, no, I would love to. And I will start by saying that a lease renewal negotiation is the number one transaction in commercial real estate. So for every time that someone moves to a new office or they do a startup, whether it's healthcare or non-healthcare, there's probably 10 times the number of lease renewals happening. So lease renewals are the number one transaction in all of commercial real estate. And with that, more healthcare providers specifically lose money in a lease renewal negotiation than any other transaction out there. It's the
I
number one,
believe it. I
yeah,
believe it.
number one transaction where healthcare providers get just completely crushed by landlords. And here's why. Most landlords are going to go into the negotiation and they're just going to assume a couple things. Number one, that the doctor doesn't have time to hire a professional. Number two, they don't have time or expertise to go to the market to understand what their options are. Number three, they're probably going to be willing to pay a premium, not to be inconvenienced to have to notify patients and move and do all those things. And so they're going to go into that negotiation with a couple pretty strong assumptions, and they're going to lean on those assumptions. And what that looks like though is higher lease rates, either less or no concessions, and they're going to make it uncomfortable. And so if you're a healthcare provider and you have a lease coming up in the next 2.5 years, now is the time to start. Don't wait till you're a few months before the lease expires, because what happens then is the landlord knows that you don't have time to move typically. It doesn't take 4 months to move a healthcare space. It takes a year because you've got to go to market, negotiate terms,
Yes.
lease, get an architect, design it, construction documents, go through permitting, building departments. Then you get to swing the hammers. Then you get to do the equipment, the technology, and then get in the space. You could do that maybe in 8 or 9 months, but it's usually a
Mhm.
year. You got to time the transaction properly. And then you say, why would you start 2 years in advance? Here's why. If you're going to buy a piece of ground and you're going to build your
Good.
own property, that is an 18 to 24-month process.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you don't want to take that off the table. Now, if you look at your options 2 years in advance and you say, hey, I don't want to buy a piece of land, I'm going to either stay or move into another lease space, then great. Then you just push pause, you put it on ice for 12 months, you come back, and then you do it when you're 12 months from the lease expiring. But if you wait till you're 12 months out, you've eliminated your ability to do ground up or to buy a piece of land, et cetera.
Yeah.
So as far as lease renewals, I can break it down to a couple of things. You've got to have a posture. You've got to have other viable options. What you might say, my top option is to stay. That's great. That can be your top option. We can work hard to keep you in the space, but you've got to have other options. The landlord has to have a concern or a fear that you can move out and the space could go vacant. If there's no concern, there's no fear, they don't believe you're going to move, they will not do you any favors.
Mm.
And they might be respectful. They might even give you a gift basket when the lease is done, but they just overcharge you by $200,000. They'll ask you to go golfing. They'll send you a Christmas card. Oh no, the landlord's my friend.
Mm.
Landlord's not your friend. Landlord wants to maximize the relationship for the highest amount of money they can get because that's how they make a living. And again, I'll use the equivalent for an orthodontist. Let's say the Invisalign should cost 6,000. There's landlords that are going out there charging people $24,000 for Invisalign. People don't know the difference. You should have paid this with a lease rate. You should have gotten free rent. You should have gotten a TI allowance to renovate the space. Your lease rate should have actually gone down. You should have gotten better, lower annual increases. You should have been able to maybe remove your personal guarantee on the second term. And unfortunately, you miss a few of those things or all those things, and they add up to a lot of money.
Yeah, that's wonderful information. And I am sure that I've got a doc out there thinking, but I remember when I signed that lease, it said something about 2 5-year options or whatever. So that means I can't negotiate, correct? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we will negotiate options to renew, and we're really doing that as an absolute like life jacket getting thrown in the middle of the ocean to save you if the worst case scenario happens. But typically, that lease renewal option, if it has set terms, is going to be inferior and usually worse terms than we can negotiate on a brand new deal. Now, again, the reason we do that is because we want to create a legal obligation for the landlord to negotiate in good faith in the sense at that market rents in the future, they've got to negotiate in good faith. If it has specific terms, again, that is a worst case scenario in case the market just completely spikes in the landlord's favor and there's some random scenario where those lease terms might be acceptable. But typically, those lease terms are going to be well above what we could renegotiate. And here's why. You start a lease rate at $25 a square foot, and then every year that lease rate ratchets up with an annual increase. And that increase typically outpaces inflation. Even in a crazy market like we've been in the last few years, that
Mm.
lease rate is usually going to finish in year 10 higher than they are marketing new space in the building. And so the lease renewal
Yeah.
option is going to pick up where the lease ended and then go up again. But we should probably be able to get back down to a lower lease rate of a few dollars a square foot. Without getting too confusing, lease renewal options are great. You want them, but it's very rare that we're exercising them. We're typically just going to acknowledge it's there, leave it in our back pocket for a worst case scenario. And then we're going to renegotiate a brand new lease with the landlord in good faith. And what we're trying to accomplish is this: we are willing to pay a slight premium not to move, slight, but we're not going to get taken advantage of compared to what they would give a new tenant. If you give a new tenant free rent, we want free rent. If you pay for a new tenant to build out a space, we want some money to renovate. If the lease rate would be, a market lease rate for a new tenant, we need a market lease rate. It might not be as competitive as a new tenant because there is a benefit of not having to move and there is a value of your
Mhm.
space is already built out. So we might not get the exact terms that a new tenant would get, but we want to get as close as possible. And we certainly don't want to get terms of an unrepresented, uneducated tenant who doesn't time it right and who basically is at the mercy of the landlord. Because again, the difference in that term or that deal is probably a couple $100,000 over a 10-year period.
Um, Colin, I really appreciate you talking about this because, like I said, I know I've got docs that are probably getting to that point. And just from what I heard, summarize as you start getting to the end of your 10-year lease, start really looking at paying attention to what you're thinking about doing at about year 8. Determine if you've got any clauses that require you to tell a landlord you're staying or going. And it can't hurt, won't cost you anything. I would assume to reach out and talk to a broker
Mhm.
to get them on board to help you determine if you are staying or if you are moving, just so that you feel good going into maybe your next 10 years, if especially if you're staying in the same location.
Correct. Yeah. And let me hit that point real quickly because that's usually the only impediment. I'd say there's two impediments to someone hiring an agent to represent them or a broker. Number one is they just don't feel like they have the time or they don't know where to go. Here's what I tell you. There's a lot of resources out there and you need to find 5 minutes to call someone. Okay. It's like the Geico commercial. 2 minutes will save you 50% or more. You getting a good agent involved could save you $100,000, $200,000. Like
Mhm.
it's worth you spending a half an hour to an hour if that's what it takes to find the right person. The other impediment is people think I don't have the money to pay for this or I don't want to pay for this. Commercial real estate is just like residential real estate in that the landlords or the sellers are responsible for the commissions. And so there's a set amount of money in every deal, whether it's a brand new lease or it's a lease renewal, where the landlord is planning on paying a commission for that tenant or that buyer's agent. If you don't have an agent, you're not saving money. If you don't have an agent, they're not discounting you that amount of money. Again, if you're a seller of a house, if the buyer shows up without an agent, like they're not cutting the price of the house. That listing agent for the seller gets a double commission,
Mhm.
or the seller might pocket it. But a lot of people say, I don't have the money or I want to save money. You're not the person in the transaction determining the commissions. You're not the person who's paying the commissions. And so you're not saving any money in this scenario. Now, landlords are famous for telling people if you don't have an agent or broker, I'll give you a better deal. And it's just that is we call that the doctor discount. It's like, all right, listen, I can sell to you. We can do 25 cents each, or if you want to buy in bulk, I'll give you three for $1. And people are like, oh, and it's a bulk sale. Like, they just hear no broker, better deal. Meanwhile, the landlord is laughing all the way to the bank, being like, man, who is this person that just bought off on that? And you say, why would a landlord do that? Landlords are in it to make money. All right. Landlords they want the highest returns. And I keep saying this, I don't mean this to be rude to people, but the landlord's not your friend. They can be a professional relationship, but a friend is somebody that if you needed them in the middle of the night to come over and give you like $10,000, they would do it without asking. Landlord's not going to give you $5 without you giving them something. That's okay. That's a business relationship. It's not a friend. They might be friendly, but it's not a friend.
Mhm.
So just realize that landlords are in it to make money and they've got money set aside. And then I'll give you one more thing about this too. The landlords wouldn't say something like that to Chipotle or Chick-fil-A or Starbucks or Charles Schwab or Lockheed Martin or a big company. They would never tell them that because they know those companies know better. When you
Mhm.
hire someone who knows the market, the landlord's going to be a lot less likely to make some ridiculous statement or some lie because they're going to know that agent is not going to play that. They're going to tell the tenant, listen, this landlord's playing games. They're not operating with integrity. And so the landlords are less likely to play games when there's a good agent involved and when they know that the tenant has been educated by a good agent. So it just positions you to where you can avoid a lot more of the you can avoid a lot of the back and forth. You can avoid a lot of the games when you got a good person involved. And when you don't, the landlords will take a shot at you and they will see how far they can push you. And it's just a really bad experience. Anyone who's ever done a deal and had a landlord push their buttons, it's just not a place you want to be.
Once again, great information. I completely agree with you. And we just really have to be careful. It's so easy to think that everybody's got our back. And I think you and I both know, having been in this for a long time and working with younger doctors and newer business owners, that that's unfortunately just not the case in a lot of the arenas out there. Docs, what I would tell you is just make sure you're really picking the right people to be on your team, so that you know that to the best of your ability, you've got multiple people looking out, saying the same thing and really taking care of you. So, Colin, as we finish up here, I'm anxious to hear, what do you think is going to go on in our market? I know you said you started off by saying nobody's got a crystal ball. Definitely, I'm not going to hold you to anything, but do you see any big changes coming that you think we're going to need to be aware of?
Yeah, so I do pretend to have my own crystal ball, and I try to pretend that I know what's going on sometimes. Here's what I think is going to happen personally. I think it's going to remain a very competitive commercial real estate market. I don't think we're going to see this huge mass correction like you saw in 2009, 10, 11, where the market just totally tanked. Interest rates are up, but again, there's still so much money in the economy. And so here's my quick like economics lesson is yes, we had two different presidents that just flooded the economy with more money than ever before. And it helped people put more money in their pockets. And so that pushed huge inflation and huge supply issues. And so we've got so much money in our economy right now that it's really preventing this huge adjustment. So yes, they say that inflation is getting tamed a little bit. Sure, but it's not going to have a huge effect on the commercial real estate market. The commercial real estate market's going to stay competitive. They say that the residential market is slowing, and it is in a lot of places. Some markets, it's not slowing at all. Like I was talking to, we have some people down in Southwest Florida, Naples area, and I was talking to a person down there. That residential market is on fire. So people don't care if it's a 7% interest rate, they're ready to go. So some markets in residential are slowing. Some markets are coming to a screeching halt. That will affect the economies in those cities or whatever. But the commercial market, I don't see having a huge dip. I could see it slightly coming down a little bit, but I don't see a massive correction unless there's some like stock market crash or some
Mhm.
dramatic situation or occurrence. So, they're saying that lending rates are going to go up again once or twice more. These are the same places that rates were back in like the 2000, like 7 or 8 range. And we've seen this before. So
Yes,
if
yes.
we were doing startups back in 2007
Mhm.
and those
Yep,
doctors, a lot of those doctors are absolutely killing it today. So,
for sure, for sure.
so
Yep.
I would say this in summary, I don't see a huge event that's going to dramatically shake the commercial market unless it is something dramatic like a world war or something like with the stock market just totally getting annihilated. So outside of a dramatic event, I think we're going to keep just seeing business as usual. I think we're going to see residential markets soften a decent amount and start bringing some prices down a little bit. But the commercial market always lags the residential by about a year or 2 years. So it would take a pretty good bust in the residential market before the commercial market feels that. So again, my comment to everyone is the same. Hire the best people you can, do the best you can with the current environment, get the best interest rates, the best lease rates. And then when the time comes, renegotiate your lease, purchase a building, refinance your loan, get more creative with marketing, hire better staff, do the best you can with what you have and realize that it'll look different in 5 years, look different in 10 years. Who knows if there's a pandemic? Just nobody knows these things. Do the best you can with what you have right now and keep your head up and just keep moving forward.
Wonderful information. So, Colin, as we finish up here, I know we've just covered a lot. Is there anything that you want to leave us with where you're like, Jill, there's this one point that I wanted to make, or there's this one thing that I think that the audience needs to hear that we didn't discuss?
I would just echo my last statement of hire your representation, do your due diligence, surround yourself with the best people possible, and let them hold your hand through the process. It's what they do best. It's what they specialize in. Just like a patient's coming to you to get their teeth or their bite. Thanks. Like you're their professional. Let someone else be your professional in every area in practice management, marketing, real estate, construction. Let people that are really good be your top advocate and ally and let them do the best work they can for you to put you in the place where you can be as successful as possible.
Perfect. So if somebody wants to get a hold of a car agent, they're like, you know what, I'm ready to renegotiate a lease, or I'm out there and I am thinking I'm going to take Colin's advice and why wait till tomorrow when I can get started today? What's the best way for anybody to reach out?
Yeah, the best way to reach us is our website, and that is carr.us, carr.us. Upper right hand corner, you can click to find an agent. You can click for a free lease evaluation. And so find the person who's in your state or in your market, give them a call, shoot them an email, and then they will take you from there. They'll get a copy of your lease. They can tell you if your current terms are really competitive. If they're really poor, they can tell you when you want to start the transaction or start your due diligence. And they can tell you what your upcoming opportunities are. They can say, listen, for what you're paying, you could own real estate for much less than you're paying in lease, or you could upgrade to a much nicer property, or we could renegotiate your lease and save you 1,000 a month or whatever it is. They'll be able to start advising you, saying, here are your options. Here's the time frame. And again, they're just going to start preparing you with information. You're going to ultimately make the decision, but you're going to be equipped to make the best decision.
Yeah, that's wonderful. All right. Thank you again for all of this information. You guys are one of my companies that I just really lean on a lot. And I know that every time I've got a client that is working with one of your agents, I know I don't have to worry,
Yeah.
which takes a lot off of me. So as I like to finish up, hey docs, I always like to finish with a little speed round. Are you ready for the speed round challenge?
Let's do it.
All right. Coffee or
T.
favorite outdoor activity?
I would say playing in the ocean or playing in the water, boating, water, anything outside.
Perfect. If you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
Positively impacting the lives of as many people as possible.
Wonderful. I love that. And then the best piece of advice you've ever received.
Wow. You left me with the hardest one. I would say be humble, be teachable, do the best you can, put your best foot forward each day, and just build long-term relationships.
Hmm.
That's 4 or 5 pieces of advice right there. But yeah,
Yep, that's perfect. Colin, thanks again for being on Hey Docs. I just know we had an audience that were just hanging on everything you had to say here. So thank you.
absolutely. It's been fun being with you, Joe.
Yep. See ya.